it can really feel like you're drowning in information these days. You know,
Oh, absolutely.
every time you turn around, there's like a new headline, some new study, another expert telling you what to think.
It is a lot.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
So that's really why we do this show, the deep
Yeah.
dive,
Right.
try to cut through all that noise and really get to the heart of what matters.
Absolutely.
And today we are diving deep into a book that you specifically asked us to explore.
Oh, very cool.
Yuval Noah Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century.
Yeah, a good one.
Um,
Unlike Harari's other books, Sapiens and Homo Deus,
mhm.
this one's not like a grand historical narrative or a prediction of the future.
Yeah, you're right. It's more a collection of like thought-provoking ideas.
Right.
Almost like little lessons designed to really get you thinking about the biggest conversations happening right now.
Right.
And what I think is so interesting about this book is that it really came out of conversations that Harari was having with the public.
So it's already kind of in dialogue with the concerns that I think a lot of us are grappling with,
Yeah.
So it's
Exactly. So our mission today, especially for you listening, is to really pull out those key insights, those kind of aha moments from 21 Lessons that can help you make sense of this crazy world we're living in.
absolutely.
The 21st century.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack the technological changes, coming at us, the shifts in global politics, what even is truth in a world flooded with information, and even those big questions like, what does it all mean?
Right.
You
Like, what's it all about in this crazy new world?
in this bewildering new age.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's important to remember is that these lessons, as Harari calls them,
Right.
they're not like definitive answers.
No.
He's not claiming to have all the answers.
Right.
He really emphasizes that the goal is to kind of spark your own thinking and get you involved in these conversations that we all need to be having.
Right.
So the book itself is structured into 5 parts. He looks at technological challenges like disillusionment work, liberty, equality, and then he moves into political challenges with community, civilization, nationalism, and then he kind of shifts gears and looks at things like despair and hope, the nature of truth, and finally resilience.
Okay.
So we're going to touch on themes from all these different sections today to give you a good overview.
All right. So let's dive into that first big idea that Harari lays out, which is, kind of this postponement of what some people thought was the end of history.
Okay.
Right? He talks about how we as humans tend to think in terms of stories.
Right.
And in the 20th century, there were these 3 huge narratives that were really competing, trying to explain everything.
Right.
Fascism, communism, and liberalism.
Yeah, those are the big ones.
Yeah. So take us through that a little bit. Like, what happened?
Well, I think the key thing for you to understand is that after World War II, fascism was pretty much discredited. I mean, it had a pretty bad run.
Not a good look.
Not a good look.
Not a good look.
So the global stage then became kind of a battleground between these two other stories, the communist story
Yeah.
and the liberal story.
Right.
And then, of course, the communist story kind of lost its momentum in the late 1980s.
Right. It kind of fell apart.
Yeah, it really did.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like at that point, the liberal story, with its emphasis on individual freedom, democratic processes,
Right.
all that kind of stuff.
The markets.
The markets. It
Yeah.
seemed like that was the blueprint for the future.
Like it had won.
Yeah, exactly.
The end of history.
The end of history, that's what they called it.
Right.
At least for a lot of the world's leaders and thinkers at the time.
Right. But then, as Harari points out, came the disillusionment.
Right.
Like things like Brexit and then the rise of someone like Trump.
Yeah.
It showed that this globalizing aspect of liberalism,
Yeah.
it wasn't working for everyone.
Right.
It wasn't universally embraced.
Not at all.
And there was this growing skepticism
Yeah.
towards this like dominant narrative.
Absolutely.
So what do you think is different about this challenge to liberalism?
Well, the thing is, this isn't quite like those previous challenges.
Right.
It's not
Yeah.
like communism or fascism,
Right.
which were like these really clear ideological opponents.
Right.
They had a whole other system,
Right.
a whole other vision for how the world should work.
Right.
But this is almost more like what Harari calls nihilistic.
Huh. Interesting.
It's not about proposing a whole new system.
Right.
It's more about a rejection
Right.
of the existing one.
Okay.
I mean, think about it. Trump didn't really offer like a detailed global vision.
Right. He was
It was more about pulling back.
Right. America first.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the Brexiteers, too.
Right.
Their main argument was just to leave.
Wait.
but where to go from there.
Right.
Not always so clear.
Not so clear.
So it's a rejection.
A rejection.
Without a clear alternative.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, a lot of the people who supported Trump or Brexit, they didn't actually reject those core liberal values.
No.
Like, they still believed in things like democracy
Yeah.
and free markets and human rights.
Right.
But they wanted those things to kind of stop at the border.
Yeah.
Like, there was this feeling of, maybe building stronger national boundaries.
Right.
And being more careful about who we let in.
Yeah.
That was the way to protect freedom and prosperity at home.
Exactly. And then you've got China.
Right.
Which is this rising superpower.
Right. A huge force.
Huge force.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily proposing like a rival global story
Right.
in the same way that communism did.
Right.
But they definitely have their own way of doing things, their own approach to government international relations.
Right.
And they're also pretty wary of this like universal liberal vision.
Right. They're doing their own thing.
Very much so.
Yeah. So it seems like this kind of weakening of the liberal story has led to all these like nostalgic fantasies,
Oh, yeah.
popping up.
Yeah, for sure.
You've got Make America Great Again. This idea of like going back to a past glory.
Right.
You've got the Brexit dream of like a powerful, independent Britain.
Right.
Like hearkening back to the Victorian era.
Yeah.
China looking back to its Confucian roots.
Uh-huh.
Putin with this vision of like a resurrected Tsarist empire.
Yeah.
It feels like everyone's looking to the past for answers.
Right. Like we know what worked back then, so let's just go back to that.
Yeah.
But the world has changed.
But the world is so different now.
So different.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to see this appeal of these nostalgic visions
Right.
in the face of like these huge,
Yeah.
unprecedented challenges.
Unprecedented technological and global challenges.
It just shows you how much we crave comfort,
Right.
familiarity,
Yeah.
even if those narratives don't really fit with the complex reality of the 21st century.
Speaking of unprecedented challenges,
Yeah.
let's talk about the technological ones.
Oh.
And specifically how this might affect, you listening out there,
Yeah.
your future in the workforce.
Right.
Harari argues that the threat to jobs isn't just from automation,
Yeah.
what we call infotech, information technology,
Yeah. Right.
but it's from the combination of infotech and biotech,
Right.
which is this growing ability to like understand
Yeah.
and potentially copy human skills at a biological level.
Right.
Like we're getting really good at that.
We are.
So what does that mean for us?
Well, I think what's happening is that AI is becoming so good at recognizing really subtle
Right.
biochemical patterns, like
Right.
facial expressions,
Yeah.
tiny changes in your voice,
Right.
body language, all these things that humans
Yeah.
use to understand each other.
Right. Yeah.
A therapist reading their client's emotions
Okay.
or a salesperson
Right.
gauging a customer's interest.
Right.
They're constantly analyzing these cues. And an AI with the right sensors could potentially do all of that
Right.
way more precisely
And consistently.
than a human ever could.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that makes you think like, what are the implications for
Yeah.
all sorts of fields?
Right.
Harari even suggests that like in the next few decades, computers could be better than humans
Oh, wow.
at things like psychiatry and bodyguarding
Wow.
because of,
Yeah.
how much we're learning about the brain
Right.
and how emotions work at a chemical level.
Yeah. That's incredible.
Right.
Yeah.
And it goes so much further than that.
It does.
Like think about something like music recommendations,
Oh, yeah. For sure.
An AI that's analyzed millions of listening experiences could like figure out exactly what songs
Right.
would resonate with your emotional state
Right.
at any given moment.
At any given moment.
Like even connecting them to like subconscious memories
Wow.
that you don't even realize you have.
Yeah. Yeah.
No human DJ could ever do that.
Right. Yeah.
This leads to a really kind of scary idea that Harari talks about.
Oh, yeah.
This potential shift from exploitation to irrelevance.
Oh, wow.
And it's not just about robots taking our jobs.
Yeah.
It's about this possibility that like the economic elite
Right.
might just not need most of us anymore.
Wow. So we
We
become
become irrelevant.
irrelevant. And what does that do to society?
Right.
What happens?
Right. Because if you think about it,
Yeah.
like a lot of the big social and political upheavals in the past
Yeah.
were driven by people who were like essential workers,
Right.
but they didn't have any power.
Right.
But now we might see movements fueled by people who still have political power,
Right.
but they're scared of losing their economic value
Right.
and becoming irrelevant.
Right.
And fighting against irrelevance
Right.
is very different from fighting against exploitation.
Right, because you can't even get in the game.
Exactly.
You're just out.
You're out.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
when you think about this future,
What are some of the solutions that Harari puts out there?
well, he talks about a few things,
Yeah.
like maybe slowing down automation,
Okay.
trying to create completely new jobs.
Right.
And then there's this idea of universal basic income.
Okay, so let's go through each one of those.
Yeah.
Like slowing down automation.
Yeah, that seems like a simple solution,
Right.
but it would also mean losing out on all the good things that AI and robots could bring.
Right.
Governments could try to regulate it,
Right.
but it would be really hard to get the balance right.
Right.
And then creating new jobs.
All right.
I mean, it's tough to predict what those would even be.
Right.
And if there will be enough of them to replace the ones we lose.
Right. And then universal basic income?
Right. This is giving everyone a regular income.
Right.
No matter if they're working or not.
Right, so it's like a safety net.
Yeah, it sounds good in theory,
Right.
but Harari raises some interesting questions.
Okay, what are those?
Well, what if even with universal basic income, people still don't have that sense of purpose?
Right.
Social connection.
Right.
Status.
Right.
You know?
It's like those deeper human needs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then maybe the competition shifts to like non-essential luxury.
Right. It's just other ways of showing off.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then you could end up with even bigger gaps
Right.
between the haves and have-nots.
And those gaps might be impossible to bridge.
Potentially.
Yeah.
And Harari reminds us that happiness is a lot about expectations.
Right.
And our expectations change.
Right.
So even if we improve living standards,
Right.
it doesn't always mean we'll actually be more satisfied.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about free will
Okay.
and how this whole rise of big data is changing how we think about it.
Yeah.
So Harari explains that like the whole liberal belief system,
Right.
it's built on this idea that our feelings reflect our free will
Yeah.
and that they're like the main driver of our decisions.
Mhm. That we choose how we feel.
Yes.
For a long time, that made sense.
Right,
I mean,
right.
our feelings are basically just complex biochemical algorithms.
Right.
But they were the best system we had for making choices.
Right.
Because no one outside of us could understand those algorithms
Right.
better than we could.
Right.
Even with all the surveillance in the
Yep,
world,
yeah.
no one could really get inside your head
Right.
and figure out all your desires and motivations.
Right. So for all practical purposes, it felt like we had free will.
Yeah, exactly.
But now,
Things are changing.
because of biotech and infotech,
Right.
our understanding of biology and our ability to process tons of information,
Yeah.
Harari says that now external systems
Right.
powered by these big data algorithms,
Yeah.
they're getting so good that they might be able to understand us
Right.
better than we understand ourselves.
Wow.
Think about Google search. We
Yeah.
use it every day,
I do, multiple times a day.
right? We rely on these algorithms to find information,
Right. We don't even search anymore.
right? We just Google it.
We Google it.
And as we trust these algorithms more,
Yeah.
our own ability to like search and evaluate information
Right.
might get weaker.
Like we're outsourcing our thinking to
Right.
these algorithms.
It's like the use it or lose it principle,
Exactly.
but for our brains.
Right. For our decision making.
Right.
Yeah.
So-
and it goes beyond just finding information. Like
Yes.
algorithms are starting to make bigger decisions for us.
Yeah.
Like think about self-driving cars.
Oh, yeah.
They have to make these split-second choices.
Right.
Like the trolley problem,
Right.
where the car has to decide
Yeah.
who to hit.
Who to save, who to sacrifice.
Right. So they're essentially grappling with these huge ethical questions
Hmm.
that philosophers have been debating for centuries. So as AI gets better at ethical reasoning,
Right.
Harari asks this question: would you rather be in a car next to a distracted teenager
Oh, gosh.
or an algorithm programmed with these really well thought out ethical guidelines?
Yeah.
He calls it the Schumacher-Kant team.
I love that.
Yeah.
Like driving expertise
Yeah.
and ethical principles.
Exactly.
Okay.
But this brings up a pretty scary possibility.
Yeah.
Digital dictatorships.
Oh, yeah.
Like what if governments or these powerful companies,
right?
they have all our data
Right.
and they can use it to understand us
Oh,
and
yeah.
even influence our feelings and thoughts. Like,
Yeah.
it wouldn't necessarily be this brutal totalitarian regime.
Right.
It might be more subtle,
Right.
like keeping people happy and passive.
Right. Just consuming.
Exactly like data cows.
Right.
You know, just producing data,
Right.
but never reaching our full potential.
Right.
And the crazy thing is,
Yeah.
we're putting so much money into faster internet,
Right.
better algorithms,
Right.
but we're not really investing in understanding our own minds.
Right.
Like, if we're not careful,
Yeah.
we could end up with super advanced technology
Yeah.
in the hands of people who can't think for themselves.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about this whole global situation
Okay.
and the idea of nationalism.
Right.
Because even though we're seeing this resurgence of nationalist feelings
Yeah,
around the world,
for sure.
Harari argues that global problems
Yeah.
like climate change, technology disruption,
Right.
biotech,
Yeah.
they're going to force us to work together.
It will.
We can't escape each other.
No.
It's like we're all part of this one
Yeah.
rowdy global civilization,
Exactly.
whether we like it or not.
Whether we like it or not.
Yeah,
We're all connected.
we are.
Yeah.
Think about your daily life,
Right.
your job, your economy.
Yeah.
It's all tied to these global systems,
Yeah.
these corporations,
Right.
these flows of money that are affecting people all over the world.
Absolutely.
Even countries that are like enemies.
Yeah.
They still operate within this same basic economic framework.
They do.
And like Harari says,
Yeah.
the U.S. dollar,
The dollar,
it's everywhere.
it's everywhere.
It doesn't care about political or religious divides.
It's not at all.
It's just the global currency.
right.
And it's not just economics.
Oh.
It's science,
Yeah.
too. Like, our basic understanding of the world,
Yeah.
it's pretty much the same everywhere.
It is.
Whether you're a scientist in Iran
Right.
or North Korea,
Yeah.
you're going to learn the same physics
Yeah. And chemistry.
as someone in Israel or the U.S.
Yeah, we all agree on the basic facts.
We do.
Yeah. So Harari's point is that these big challenges,
Yeah.
climate change, AI, biotech,
Yeah.
they're global problems.
Right.
And they need global solutions. We
Yeah.
have to work together.
We do.
Yeah. Okay. So, but where does nationalism fit into all of this?
Right. Because obviously it's a huge force.
It is.
Harari even calls it like this
Yeah.
research.
It's a resurgence.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting is his point about Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
Like, before those bombs,
Yeah.
the fear was that nationalism would lead to war.
Right.
But after seeing the power of nuclear weapons,
Right.
the fear became something much bigger.
Yeah.
Like total annihilation.
The end of everything.
The end of everything.
Yeah.
So in a way, this threat of nuclear war,
Right.
it actually pushed us towards creating a global community.
Right. Because we had to control this,
Yeah, had to control
this
this
massive
danger.
threat.
Yeah.
And especially in Europe,
Right.
where the threat of war has gone down,
Right.
nationalism has also changed.
How so?
Well, there's less willingness to die for the nation.
I see.
Like these movements for regional independence,
Right.
they might cause tension,
Right.
but they're not the same as the wars of the past.
Right.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about religion now.
Because Harari makes this argument that while traditional religions are still really important
Yeah.
to a lot of people for their faith and their identity,
Right.
they're not really relevant for solving the big technical and political problems.
Interesting.
So how does he explain that?
Well, if you think about it in pre-modern times,
Yeah.
religions were really practical.
In what way?
Well, they helped people with things like agriculture
Oh,
and medicine.
okay.
Like religious calendars told people when to plant and harvest.
Oh, wow.
And they believed that rituals could control the weather,
Yeah.
protect crops from failing.
Interesting.
And even healing was tied to religious beliefs.
Right.
But today,
Oh, right.
when we have problems with farming or disease,
Right.
we turn to science,
Right.
biology, technology.
We don't really look to religious doctrines for answers.
Not so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he also says that even though religions might be less relevant for those technical issues,
Yeah.
they're still hugely relevant for identity
Yeah.
and social cohesion.
And often they can actually divide people,
Yeah.
Yeah. like based on these seemingly small differences.
Right.
So he uses the example of LGBTQ plus rights,
Okay.
like in Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. You see
Yeah.
such different treatment.
Right.
In Israel, LGBTQ plus people have a lot of legal protections.
Right.
But in Iran and Saudi Arabia,
Right.
they face persecution,
Yeah.
even death.
Yeah.
It's pretty stark.
It's really stark.
And these differences are deeply rooted in religious interpretations.
Right.
And they have these really real-world consequences.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Harari also points to historical examples.
Okay.
Like in Japan,
Yeah.
during their modernization in the 19th and 20th centuries,
Right.
they used state Shinto.
What is that?
It was a way of using traditional religion
Okay.
to create this strong sense of national loyalty
Oh, wow.
and a death-defying spirit of sacrifice,
Wow.
which they saw as essential for catching up to the West,
Yeah.
technologically and militarily.
Dangerous.
And you can still see governments doing similar things today.
Yeah, using religion for national goals.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's get into this really interesting area.
Okay.
Truth and fiction.
All right.
Harari makes this kind of unsettling argument that humans are actually better at making up stories and believing them
Right.
than we are at figuring out what's actually true.
Yeah, like we're wired for stories.
Right.
And he says that this focus on narrative, it's actually helped us survive.
Oh, wow.
So how does that work? Well, he makes this distinction between fake news,
Okay.
which is usually short-lived and not that many people believe it,
Right.
and religions,
Okay.
which can last for thousands of years
Right.
and be believed by billions.
Right.
And his point is that fiction, it's incredibly powerful
In what way?
for getting people to cooperate
Right.
on a large scale.
Okay.
Like, think about the Bible.
Okay.
It might not be literally true, but it's inspired so much passion,
Right.
creativity,
Yeah.
community building
Yeah.
over such a long time.
Right. It's brought people together.
It has.
Yeah.
It's like other great works of literature.
Yeah.
They can have this huge impact,
Right.
even if they're not factual.
Right. So,
Well-
but there's a dark side to this, too.
Oh, yeah, there is.
Right. Because lies, when they're repeated enough,
Yeah,
they can start to seem like truth.
right.
Harari talks about Goebbels and Hitler.
Right, the Nazi propaganda machine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were masters of this.
There were.
And in today's world, with so much information flying around
Okay.
and misinformation,
Right.
it's even harder to know what to believe.
Absolutely.
So Harari has this warning for us.
Okay.
If you're not paying for your news,
Yeah.
you're the product.
You're the product being sold.
Right.
That's a good one.
Yeah, like all this free content.
Yeah.
It's not really free.
It comes at a cost.
It comes at a cost. It can reinforce our biases,
Right.
manipulate us
Yeah.
in ways we don't even realize.
Absolutely.
So how do we deal with all this,
Right.
this uncertainty, this information overload?
Well, Harari talks about the need for mental clarity,
Right.
which is something I think we often overlook.
We do.
And he even gets personal here.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about his own meditation practice.
Really?
Yeah.
So he's been meditating for a long time,
Yeah.
and he says that it helps him deal with all this complexity.
Oh, that's interesting.
So what did he learn from that?
Well, he realized that a lot of his suffering
Yeah.
wasn't really from things happening in the world.
Right.
It was from his own reactions to them.
His thoughts about them.
Yeah, his thoughts, his interpretations.
Right.
So he learned to observe these mental patterns
Right.
without judgment.
Right. Just watch them go by.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that helped him see things more clearly.
So he does this daily meditation practice, and he also goes on these longer silent retreats.
Yeah.
And he says it's not about escaping reality.
Right.
It's about connecting to it.